so the topic we are talking about, we all know that climate change and a warming planet are upon us. We see the effects of that globally. We've certainly felt it here in Canada, certainly felt it here in British Columbia and on the West Coast and the Lower Mainland. We know that Canada has large immigration targets for future growth, so that it should be an open door for immigrants. But what is coming is this question of those who will need to migrate because of climate. And as I said, it is already happening. So how do you balance the capacity of Canada to welcome migrants with the needs of those migrants or refugees? So I'm not the expert, but lucky for us, we have some great people to talk about this. First of all, Warda Shazadi Meighen from Landings LLP, and Dr. Allison Shot from the Action on Climate team at Simon Fraser University, and Patrick Michel, who is the former chief of the Kanaka Bar Band in Lytton, BC, who has had his own experiences with climate-related disaster. We've posted full bios of them in the chat box if you want to learn more about them. And I'm going to go through each one of them and just have them give you some opening remarks about the things that they think are important to mention. So we will start with Warda. Go ahead.
Thank you, Laura. Good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining from. I am based in the city of Toronto, the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, including the Inuit, the Métis, and the Métis people. My name is Warda Shazadi Meighen. I am the co-vice president of the Canadian Association of Refugee Lawyers and the co-lead on climate migration. In my day-to-day, I'm a refugee and immigration lawyer, and I teach refugee law at the University of Toronto Law School. The Canadian Association of Refugee Lawyers' work on climate migration began when we began receiving a lot of interest on climate migration and what our position was. And there in 2020 was a decision by the United Nations Human Rights Committee, which really for the first time made the connection between climate change being a driving force in migration. And it declared that people are forced to flee their countries in the context of climate change, and that some may actually need international protection. And so that's where my work began with the Canadian Association of Refugee Lawyers on this topic in particular. And it's in this decision where we learned for the first time that there is an international obligation not to send people back to their home country due to environmental harm. So we know that in Canada, we've been seeing a lot of changes on an environmental level domestically, of course. And there's no doubt that climate change is here. And climate change leads to environmental change, and environmental change leads to the displacement of people. The question now is, how fast? How will it impact Canada, and what are we going to do about it? There have been estimates that there will be about 216 million more migrants, climate migrants, by the year 2050. And a few years ago, that was projected to be 1 in 10 people around the world. Obviously, by the accident of Canada's geography, not all of those people will, of course, find their way to Canada, but some of these people will. And so my position is that this is a key pressing issue of our generation, and that we'll be well served to have a proactive plan. Canada is uniquely placed to lead the way on the issue of climate migration, given our commitments both on the environmental and the human right front. So what an amazing opportunity for Canada. There are two things that we can do in terms of assisting with climate change. One is, of course, to cut greenhouse gas emissions. And then the second is to make a plan for climate migration. And so I'm hoping through the question period that we can really touch on what that plan in terms of climate migration looks like.
Warda, thank you so much. And next is Dr. Allison Shot from the Action on Climate team at Simon Fraser University. Allison, go ahead.
Hello, good evening, everyone. Nice to be here. Nice to see you, Laura and Warda. My name is Dr. Allison Shot. I work at SFU in the Action on Climate team. However, I'm calling in from the Skszwx territory of the Okanagan Valley. And this is a beautiful land in southeastern BC that I'm happy to live, work, and play in. And my particular connection with climate migration dates back to the third assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change when I was doing my dissertation. And the issue of climate migration resulting from projected climate impacts started to emerge then. And people started thinking about the numbers of different of people that would be affected by climate changes. That number from the third assessment report in 2001 to the sixth assessment report, which is the most recent one, has almost tripled in terms of projected increases of climate migration. In addition, my work as a climate change researcher over the past 25 years has seen not only those numbers triple, but also a recognition that human-induced climate change is accelerating. It's happening quicker than was originally anticipated. And so what we're starting to see are the impacts that have been projected for the past 30 years, not only in far off lands like small island states and Bangladesh, but also on our back doorsteps, as we saw last year with the atmospheric river, and we're seeing occur with the cascading impacts of drought, wildfire, and flood. And so what I'm interested in is how we respond to these accelerating conditions. So Warda talked about, the international scale of action, like how do we prepare Canada for opening our borders to climate migrants or environmental migrants? And what are the kind of policies or different characteristics associated with that type of policy? One of the interesting effects of climate change is there's sudden impacts, which we've been talking about in terms of natural disasters, which affect emergency preparedness and disaster planning, but there's also onset climate change impacts that tend to be linked to crop failure, water scarcity, these types of issues that aren't directly correlated to climate change. And so a lot of people that are seeking, that are migrating internally don't see themselves as climate refugees or migrants, but often see themselves as, behooven to socioeconomic conditions. And so the work that I do with ACT right now is what we talk about at ACT is manage the avoidable and avoid the unmanageable. So as Warda mentioned, one of the opportunities is to reduce our emissions. As a developed country, we have a responsibility to do that to developing nations, but also to encourage adaptation, both through our international development funds internationally, so that different developing nations can build their socioeconomic systems to be better adapted to projected impacts. And more importantly, to my direct work at the Action on Climate team at SFU, to work with communities in Canada to better understand their climate risks and vulnerabilities and prepare in advance to respond to those risks. And what we know from the climate science is that spending $1 today on adaptation at the community level can actually save up to or more than $15 into the future. So my interest in all of this is how Canada is really going to leverage climate adaptation at a community level across the nation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Shot. Just forgot to unmute myself. There we go. That leads nicely into our final panelist, who is and has been involved in adaptation in a big way with his own people. Patrick Michel is the former chief of the Kanaka Bar Band in Lytton, BC. Patrick, go ahead.
Thank you, Laura, and good afternoon and good evening, everybody. So I think the best way to put it is that there's going to be a bio that will be posted over here. So I was born in the British Columbia, Fraser Canyon region, and I've lived here all my life. And over the last 57 years, I've seen changes in water and wind and heat and drought and cold and snow. And so those are seasonal. But by the late 80s, we began to see something different. And when I say something different, one thing we had after 8,000 years of living in the same place was a collective conscious knowledge about weather patterns, seasons, ecosystem cycles. That doesn't exist anymore. So let's take that as a given. So regardless of where you are in this place we call the world, site-specific changes are starting to occur. And I believe it was about 1988 to 1992 when a label called climate change started to arise. So climate change was identified as we're heating up the earth, the air, the land, and the water. And as a result of that, it's starting to supercharge our weather. And our weather basically consists of heat, wind, rain, and cold. And so now we're experiencing today extreme weather events. And in 2019, my hometown of Lytton, well, we experienced a wind event that was never seen before or even known in our hearts, which was a summertime north to south wind that lasted 5 minutes and tore roofs off and patios and other items. It never made the news. We just repaired it. But in 2021, in June of 2021, the Pacific Northwest experienced a heat dome. And that heat dome was highly unusual because it supercharged everybody. We had no summer rain. We had some heavy rains in the spring that created all sorts of greening. And then the drought we experienced and the heat basically crisped everything. And then on June 29th, if I'm not mistaken, my hometown hit 49.6 degrees Celsius, which is the hottest recorded temperature in Canada. Although the temperature gauges that we have installed at my home community of Kanaka Bar were reading around 53 degrees Celsius. So what existed on June 30th was these conditions of tinder dry conditions that required one spark, and that happened. And so the story of the Lytton fire made international news. An entire town was lost, and over 1,200 people were displaced, and that number grew incrementally as the fire expanded. The displacement, and this was an eternal displacement as people fled to the north and to the south to avoid the damage. But after the fire was out, those people whose homes survived the fire were able to come back, and once electricity was installed, were able to move back into their homes. But for the families who lost their homes, today is January 23rd, 2023. I'm still not on my home, and I'm still not on the land that I own. The fire had burnt down and released so much toxics into the soil that it became a health risk to move back. But on top of that, there was many unresolved issues pertaining to archaeology, so that the time frame for actually getting back onto our homeland is delayed because of immediate health and safety concerns. And so as we move back, I managed to get back to Lytton in October of 2021, and we just set up an RV. And then the atmospheric river hit and wiped out all the roads. So I got back to my homeland. I wasn't on my home, but I was at least a kilometer south. And then all the roads were washed out. So I will call it a compounding extreme weather event. So the massive amount of rain triggered landslides and water slides that wiped out the roads. And of course, we saw what happened down in Lower Mainland. So we were just getting over that when in December, late December, and people don't realize it, Lytton experienced never before 4 feet of snow, as well as temperatures between -27 and 32. So again, for the families that were here, living in their little camper trailers, we had now experienced heat, fire, wind, rain, cold. compounding extreme weather events in one location, and that's in Canada. Across the world, we're starting to see these events occurring everywhere. And one of the things is that with climate change and these extreme weather events, one of the things that the world population has to be considering is, will I have water? Water is critical, because without water, there is no life. So as we start looking across the world, if you stay in your hometown, if you stay in your homeland, and there's no water, you will die. If you have water, is it still enough that you can grow the food that you need to eat? Are you going to live in homes that become heat traps, so that if it's 55 degrees Celsius, if you stay inside that home, you're going to die inside that home? So there's a lot of questions that are posed. And as two of the previous speakers mentioned, the numbers of people who are going to be losing physiological foundations of life, water, food, and shelter, has grown exponentially. And as awareness takes off, if you stay, you're going to die. At Kanaka Bar, we had a saying, you can fight, die, move, or innovate. And we've said it's not innovative to go back to a sustainable way of living. But the thing is, today's humanity is not as resilient as our ancestors. For some reason, we become a little fragile. We drink treated water. We can't necessarily drink untreated water. So as my hometown and my family enter into a period of rebuilding, what are we going to do about our brothers and sisters globally who are going to be experiencing their own catastrophic losses? Will we open up our doors? And the answer for me is yes. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you, Patrick. Such a compelling question and answer that you asked there, especially coming from your own particular experience and perspective. I want to now get into some more questions and discussion. When you registered, many of you sent in questions for the panelists. We summarized them into some key themes so that we can address them during the discussion. But if you have more questions that you want to ask during the event, please post them in the Q&A box and we'll get to them after this initial discussion. Let me just turn to some of those now. I think Patrick kind of answered this question of explaining the connection between climate change and immigration to somewhere in Canada, but there's also this idea of the connection between climate change and immigration to Canada. Warda, I just wonder if we start that off, if you can address this idea of a right, because we know that refugees are deemed to have a reasonable likelihood of persecution. That is a way of claiming refugee status, but there's no explicit right to claim refugee status based on climate. So how do you see the law not measuring up, and where is the potential for changing that so that it would be easier for these kinds of refugees to get into Canada?
So currently there is no explicit avenue, as you suggest, Laura, for a person to come to Canada on the basis of climate-induced displacement. There are several things that we can do in Canada. One is to expand the definition of a refugee explicitly. So the gap right now is the concept of a refugee has this this concept of persecution tied into it. And a person has to have a well-founded fear of persecution. Within this concept of persecution is this further concept that an individual has to have a personalized risk. So someone has to be, after them, in a colloquial sense. And so when we are looking at environmental degradation or drought, there isn't this agent of persecution because it's often a community that is equally impacted. So if we could perhaps create a subset of a refugee definition where a person doesn't have to be personally attacked, for example, in the case of climate-induced displacement, then we would have protection for climate migrants. We can have a definition of a climate migrant, for example, where a person could be outside of their country of nationality, where because of their, livelihood or home being affected by short-term or long-term environmental factors, they just don't have a home anymore and they're a climate refugee. We could put that right into our legislation. We don't have that right now. We can also have humanitarian pathways. In this parallel framework, we have a humanitarian class. We haven't done that either. We could create temporary programs for refugees. We haven't done that either. So there are a host of avenues that we can start to pilot. We haven't done that. So we have to start taking action, either legislatively or through policies, so that people have explicit pathways for protection.
I have to ask you, Warda, I know you've been working on talking to the federal government about this. It is a federal responsibility in all places except Quebec. So what kind of a reception are you getting to these things?
So we have created a report in 2021, and we are now about to release an update for this report. And we have created dialogue, and we have met with the previous Minister of Immigration, and it was a productive meeting. And now obviously there's a new Minister of Climate and the Environment, but so far we haven't seen any new legislation. And Immigration and Refugee Citizenship Canada says that it will evaluate these cases on a case-by-case basis.
Okay. Allison, I'm wondering what similarities and differences you see, if any, in the challenges that are faced by people who are displaced by environment issues, climate change issues, compared to people displaced by war or persecution.
Well, I think just going back to Warda's comment about there being kind of a person or organization that is doing the persecuting is the biggest difference in these types of conditions. What we could think about and what we've been discussing at the international level in climate negotiations for decades is the responsibility of developed countries toward developing countries. And the reason for that is because the developed nations have had the advantages of developing and emitting emissions, whereas there are disproportionate impacts on already vulnerable populations. And so I think that concept comes up because it kind of suggests with environmental migration, we often see environmental natural disasters, for instance, as acts of God, but that has typically, well, that's changing dramatically with the human fingerprint on climate change now and the extreme weather and extreme conditions that we're seeing. And so in my line of work, it really comes back to that sense of, global governance and what kind of responsibility developed nations have to developing countries in terms of supporting them toward adapting to these projected impacts through development funds, but also in terms of reducing our own emissions rapidly. The other piece of that is also a domestic piece. So to what extent does Canada have an obligation to its communities? What role does the federal government play in supporting communities and municipalities, local and regional governments in preparing for what we know are really accelerating climate impacts, and what types of responsibilities come along with that?
Well, Allison, you did it again. You just gave me a great segue to Patrick. I mean, Patrick, because of your experience, you said, yes, we are prepared to take these people in. But I wonder, given, and you could talk to us a little bit about what the response was from the federal and BC governments with everything that happened in and around Lytton. How prepared do you think governments are to welcome and support climate refugees?
Well, let's before we get into the support for climate refugee, I want to remind people that everybody knew what was going to happen. So in British Columbia, we had extreme fires and extreme flooding, and that was codified in a report by Chief Maureen Chapman and George Abbott. I believe he was the minister at the time, and it's called the new normal. So what we had here is, so we knew what was coming. We knew what British Columbia, we know what Canada's facing, yet we chose not to act. So that puts us into response mode. And as Dr. Shaw pointed out, when I grew up, a stitch in time saves 9, an ounce of prevention equals a pound of cure. So why don't you invest today to reduce the impacts tomorrow? But we're addicted to response mode. And this is what's coming up in climate migration. We're going to sit down here and say, oh, we didn't see the millions, if not billions of people displaced by environmental impacts. If they stay in their homes, in their homelands, they're going to die. Our government, in theory, responds to the requests of Canadians, federally, provincially, regionally, municipally. Has there been an ask to the federal government to develop climate migration policy? So that may be a question for Warda, because I don't know that. But I do know that what's happening here is underneath the Canadian immigration policy, it's usually an individual applies and they have a special skill set or maybe some dollars. And there's this long drawn out process that sees them take years to come to Canada in some way, shape, or form. Refugee, also very individual, maybe sometimes families. But climate migration is impacting huge families, extended families, entire communities. Many who may have learning challenges, AKA they can't read nor write. They don't have any money. They don't have any special education. They don't have any special tools. So they don't qualify underneath immigration, as I understand it. And since they're not dealing with a war or seeking persecution, or you say somebody's out to get them, they don't qualify refugee status. So what then is a climate migrant? For me, how do we get those individuals? Because Canada is uniquely protected. You have to remember, migration occurred over thousands of years. You did this, okay? How do you cross the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean? So you're going to have this massive challenge as countries, entire countries. So there'll be internal displacement, but they're going to need to move somewhere there's stability. So how do we work with countries experiencing internal displacement? They're overwhelming either the towns or the cities that have built up. How do we work with countries experiencing massive climate migration so that we can get families that are over here to BC, to Canada? But remember, until our government says we want to open our doors, we're not going to do that. So that means as our brothers and sisters suffer, we're going to have a lot of people sitting around saying we should probably develop a climate migration policy, one that sees entire families relocated. I don't know how you're going to choose them. I really don't. But I know that I spent the last 2 years helping families who were internally displaced here in my hometown. The federal and provincial governments were not ready. The systems that we had in place were overwhelmed. It overwhelmed the people, the resources, other resources like money. They were late coming to the table. So there was no emergency preparedness response plans. Whether they're volunteers, whether there are agencies like Red Cross, it was too much all at once, followed by compounding. We designed an emergency response system that says, oh, 2 or 3 days later, you'll be back home. 2 years later, many people aren't home. So they're sitting here living off of resources, whether it's hotel rooms, whether it's other forms of relief, whether it's aid. And then how do we get them home? And then for the climate migration families, how do we bring them into, let's say, Lytton? Hi, I don't have drinking water, I don't have operating sewage, and I don't have housing. Come on to Lytton. So maybe we'll get into that a little bit more, but if we don't have resilient homes, it's kind of hard to open up our doors to people who are suffering. And one of my greatest concerns now as a human being, as a father and as a grandfather, is that we can deploy resources to communities across the globe that are suffering. That is offloading and sending resources. But that humanitarian relief will come to an end if our bed is burning and Canada's bed is burning. So how do we help people suffering internationally if we're not even meeting the needs of Canadians? So it's going to be a unique challenge. How do we bring people here to a place that's scorched earth, or however that works? So it doesn't necessarily answer the question, Laura, that you're posing, but it does raise the thing that I believe there is a need. And if we get ahead of that need, and going back to what Warda said, Canada can be a leader. We can lead up and set up the process that sees families brought to our country and given a safe place to live.
On the contrary, Patrick, I think you answered the question very well, and you raised a lot of really important points there. And I'm wondering if Warda or Allison, you want to pick up on anything that Patrick had to say? Just jump in if you would like.
Yeah, we have absolutely asked for policy, and I think, Patrick, you're right that we need a proactive approach. I think one of the worst things that we can do as a country is an ad hoc approach. So, litigation is going to happen. It's, a number of organizations are developing, of course, test case litigation on climate, migrants, and that's going to happen inevitably, of course, and there's going to be charter litigation, but that's not the best policy response, right? An ad hoc approach to climate migration is not in the best interest of the country. It's not thoughtful in terms of what Canada needs, but it will happen and it has to happen. The best approach is to have a thoughtful legislative change. It's to have thoughtful guidelines on humanitarian and compassionate reform. It's to have a public policy class that looks at how to bring families in, to give them permanent residence. It's to stop removal of people who are already in Canada, who have no home to return to, because that conserves resources. And it's to give ministers instructions from not removing people who are already in Canada. So there's lots of things that can be done. We've put this plan to the minister. So it's, it's really, the ball is in their court. I think there are a lot of things on the immigration file that require the minister's immediate attention. And so climate migration is one of those things that ends up falling on the back burner. And so it's often not the thing that gets immediate attention, despite the fact that it probably is one of the things that now is so urgent. But I agree with you that, had we jumped on this 5, 6, 7, 10 years ago, we would be in a much better position.
And same thing with emissions. Had we jumped on this a long time ago. Yeah. Allison, is there anything you want to pick up on there?
Yeah, at our research organization, the Action on Climate team at SFU, what we're hoping to achieve is to build best practice in terms of communities building resilience within Canada. So we work a lot with local governments to look at, to integrate projected climate changes into their community planning, their emergency preparedness planning, into all of the different pieces that make up our communities, so that we are fully aware and building the capacity to be able to adapt to some of these projected changes. And until we're successful at doing that, it's this. I think Canada is going to be facing internal migration from pretty extreme weather and disaster events within our borders, as well as looking to deal with climate migration coming from other places. And so that's largely the result of a nation that is one of the top emitters in the world in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. That obviously has a moral duty, but one nation in the globe too that is very land rich and resource rich. And so I project that even though a lot of climate migration that is happening now and is projected to happen in the future is based on contiguous migration, so people moving across borders into neighboring nations and so forth, I think we're going to see a lot more distribution of that kind of migration to places like Canada. So to your point, Warda, I agree, you know, it's absolutely imperative that we're building policies now to understand what that looks like, but also preparing our communities for that. So not only for the impacts of climate change in terms of wildfires and floods and extreme heat, for instance, but also, you know, the kind of indirect impacts of, you know, economic disruption, climate migration. What does that look like? Where would we put people when they're allowed to come to Canada? Where would we house people that are illegally in Canada? And how will we do that? So
that question of where will we put them, where do we put them? Patrick, we come back to you. Have you thought about this? Are there sustainable building practices that you can think about? It's hard to make sure that there's proper affordable housing for refugees even now.
Nonsense and balderdash. There are affordable, resilient, energy efficient, and durable housing solutions out there. It just our governments have chosen not to implement it. That's it. So I don't know what people are thinking. So one of the things that we started at my community was a study. Is there such thing as affordable, resilient being to heat, wind, rain, and cold, energy efficient and durable buildings? Yes, but we choose not to implement it. Okay, so I'll leave that for people to go find that exciting stuff. And because I'm challenging Canada, I'm challenging BC. Why are we building infrastructure that is killing British Columbians and Canadians? It's because it's what we know. Now, one of the greatest, now I mentioned a little while ago that as human beings, we're not as resilient as our ancestors. And I wanted to point out, though, is that another place that is uniquely poised to collapse is our cities. So faced with some sort of weather-induced climate, land-based things, everybody migrates to the cities. And we already know that the cities, there's no place to stay. You can't afford to stay there. There's no food. And so we've already overwhelmed. So where can we bring climate migrants? To the middle of nowhere, also known as Lytton, BC. The problem is nobody wants to move here. We don't have a store. We don't have a cafe. We don't have the RCMP. We don't have a doctor, right? We don't have all these things, everything that we need. Wait, but we have land and we have resources. What we need is people who are willing to come to our community and work side by side with the Indigenous populations to create both a life and a lifestyle that is not chasing the capitalist dream, right? Foundations of life exist in rural Canada. And those are the places we go. But then it requires municipalities to say, we want to open the doors. We can get the climate migrant to an airport, but can we get them to the rural? And so will rural Canada open their doors? Or will everybody sit in the, and it's a word I've always had trouble, will they move to, let's say, hopefully it's not a derogatory, Chinatown or Little Italy? When people come to Canada, are they going to stay in these locations or will they come? In my experience, every family, the newcomers that have come to my hometown, they've become part of our community. They've run the stores. They've been in the schools. They've been to all the events. They're major volunteers in all of our events. So when I've had experience with immigration and refugee, every person I've ever met, I've seen as another human being, and they became part of our community. So for me, rural Canada is where we can take these people, whoever they may be, regardless of the language barrier, regardless of the skill sets. Rural BC needs people I'm a plumber, I'm an electrician, I dig ditches, I plow the roads, but I need help keeping up. So there are, and of course, we pay minimum wage. So if you move to rural BC, the cost of living in theory is lower, and you can earn a really decent job. And you can always participate in Vancouver and or Toronto events virtually. You can also participate in events that are hosted by your homeland virtually. You don't have to go back. You can still have a connection to your cultural identity. But will people move to rural? And I don't know, and I've heard the stories about immigrants and refugees who chose not to, but will a climate refugee move to a place knowing that they will have water, food, and shelter, and that they're welcome? So for the answer is, rural Canada is where we can take the climate migrant.
Okay,
And
Patrick.
I'd just like to build on what Patrick just said, because it really is an urban-rural kind of dilemma, as well as the rest of the planet starts to feel the effects of sea level rise in coastal cities where the majority of the population is living. So already over the past 30 years, the number of people living in coastal areas has almost doubled, increasing the exposure to those risks. And we're going to see a lot more of that shifting from coastal areas inland.
And I just want to give Patrick a bit of a plug. He's not giving it to himself, but the work that he has done with the Kanaka Bar Band, if you can look it up, in terms of making the community resilient and building that kind of those buildings that will make it through the kind of climate change shocks that are coming, is really quite remarkable. And I commend it to you. It won't work everywhere, but it works there, and it's a good model to at least look at. But speaking of models, I don't know who wants to tackle this, but are there any governments that can be used as a model for best practices when it comes to tackling climate migration? I don't know of any. Anybody want to tackle this? Oh, look, it's silent.
Laura, there's a few interesting examples that I've stumbled across, particularly in the Bay of Bengal, Bangladesh, which is notoriously at risk of extreme weather events, and has significant population living on the coastline there. And so there's a town that's quite near to the Bay of Bengal area with that vulnerable population, that's working directly with researchers right now on building resilience within their town, so that their town is able to essentially absorb a lot of the migrants that are moving from the coast and will continue to. And so that's interesting. They're looking at flood resilient houses and, you know, different concepts of livelihood and abilities to survive within their towns, and figuring out, because of the different cultural groups there, how coexistence works, which is a whole other area of interest for social science researchers in particular. Like, how do cultural groups come together and live in a coexisting peaceful way? So there is this town of Mongla, it's called, and a couple of other interesting places doing interesting things that I've come across is East African countries signing on to a freedom of movement agreement. Of course, we've been reading about the severe droughts in Eastern Africa over the past number of years, actually decades, and people are moving fairly consistently across borders in East Africa. And so this freedom of movement is kind of a multilateral arrangement between nations to ensure the safety of those climate-induced migrants from the drought that's being experienced there. And really interestingly, I just read about Argentina developing a special humanitarian visa for those fleeing socio-natural disasters and socio-natural conditions, so climate-induced conditions from different parts of South and Central America. And I thought that was an interesting approach as well.
And Warda, I don't know if you have any other places.
Yeah. So I mean, I hesitate to commend these countries because they've taken one step forward, 3 steps backwards, but Fiji, Sweden, Finland, the United States have all taken small steps forward. Fiji had granted, had stated that it would welcome climate migrants on a permanent basis, and it had temporarily, but then it had taken that back with the change in government. Sweden and Finland from 2011 to 2016 had both granted temporary and permanent immigration status to individuals who were unable to return to their countries of origin for environmental reasons. The United States had, under President Trump, made strides to study the issue of climate migrants, but from a national security perspective, which was interesting. There was also a study released.
Not about welcoming them in or keeping them out.
Depends which way you look at it. There was a study released. It was quite controversial. There was a bill that was, tabled that would allow applications for climate displaced person status at designated application centers. It was studied. It didn't ultimately, pass muster. So there has been some interest and some, obviously some initiative taken. I think that Canada should just take the leap on this. Like, clearly we should do it because there's been enough interest in it, and there are a multitude of reasons that countries haven't eventually sealed the deal. We should just go for it. But I hesitate to say that any country has been a model for it, and I think Canada should do it.
Okay, so what's stopping Canada from doing it?
I think what's stopping Canada is we get in our own way. We are often quite reactive to the emergency of the day. We also have a 4-year government cycle, like many other countries. And so what I think is required is some vision, some commitment, some leadership. We have a lot of statements put out. We, have signed the 2018 Global Compacts. We are part of the Sendai frameworks. There's a lot that we're a part of that signals the right things. We just need to get on with it and just do it. We need to put these things in policy. We need to have a very committed executive that says we're going to get this done. And, it just doesn't seem to garner the same type of political support. But if the government made this its marquee program, it would get the political support. And there are enough young people who see this as the pressing issue. And there are enough people, my generation and younger, and I'm not that young, that, there are enough people who would vote on this. And there are enough people around Canada that are affected by this in the communities that are seeing the effects of climate change. So I think it's just a matter of people of certain generations not realizing how many of us there are that really see this as a turning point issue, and how many people are physically affected by this issue. So it's an age cohort thing. Frankly, like I think as we see more and more younger people in government, and as we see enough people who are living in communities that are so deeply affected by this, it's just a numbers thing. And I think it's a matter of time. And if we had the political foresight to realize what a pressing issue this was, it's just a foresight issue.
Okay, I'm just going to turn to some of the questions that we've been getting in since we've been live. Allison, you kind of answered this already when you talked about contiguous migration, but someone asked, would it be possible to let us know from which countries climate migrants will come from? And I'm assuming that person means will come from to Canada.
Yeah, well, sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa have the largest ecological threats. So these are highly vulnerable regions, and by the middle of the century will house, the majority of the global population. And so there's a significant issue here in terms of what we see as climate-induced migration, right? So we talked about this a little bit earlier. Is water scarcity a climate-induced is it an opportunity for someone to come to Canada, or is a volcanic reaction or volcanic eruption an opportunity for someone to come to Canada? How are we differentiating these things? And it becomes very gray when you start looking at, the spectrum of climate-induced impacts. So those are the primary regions that are highly vulnerable right now and are going to likely be moving. To answer that question.
Just well, yeah, I'm going to plug my own show here, but just to give you a sense of how complicated and tangled all of these questions can be when it comes to teasing out if someone is a refugee from conflict or somebody is a refugee from climate change. On our program that's coming up this week, we're going to be highlighting Somalia because people there, as you know, are enduring famine, and many of them are dying, and they are migrating to refugee camps. They're internally displaced persons, or they're coming into the city, into Mogadishu, because that is the only way they can see to survive at this point. And you may think it's all because there's a terrorist group called Al-Shabaab and a weak government, but the fact is that Al-Shabaab has been financing itself, at least partially, by cutting down trees and wood and selling it on the black market as charcoal to fund its activities. That in turn is creating more of a problem with climate in the country, which in turn is creating more refugees. So you've got this real mess of things. And if somebody is saying, I want to claim refugee status because I can't live in my country anymore, are they climate refugees? Are they conflict refugees? It's just such a tangled web. And I just wanted to mention that because it's something that really strikes me about this whole thing, is that recognition that refugees nowadays, you can say that there's a war going on, but underlying a lot of those wars and conflicts are climate questions, and I think that will only get worse. But this is an interesting question that someone asked, and I've never thought about this before. So this is to all three of you, whoever wants to pick up on it. A question on the morality of adjusting Canada's legislation to accommodate climate migrants. Would such a policy not further contribute to the brain drain of developing countries that are struggling to cope with the worst impacts of climate change? Interesting question. Warda, you want to give that a go?
Yeah. I mean, we deal with this in all other contexts. So there's nothing particular about giving someone refuge in the context of climate migration. So if someone needs a lifeline, my position is we give them a lifeline. If it's not Canada, they go somewhere else. They go to an adjacent country. Maybe I just got a case where they've been living on the beach. It's a family that's been living on the beach for 2 years. So of course we bring them into Canada if we can. I'm not concerned about, I don't want anyone living in subpar conditions. I don't think that necessarily contributes to a brain drain. To me, a policy that would contribute to a brain drain is if we're specifically targeting skilled labor to extract very specialized positions, like very trained, doctors in a country that has a doctor shortage. If we're giving someone a lifeline because their home has been flooded, or there's water shortage, or there's drought, I don't think that that necessarily contributes. I think everyone has a right to life, liberty, and security of the person.
But it's interesting though, because I didn't write this question, but perhaps the flip side of it is Canada would be providing, and hopefully the rest of the developed or northern countries, to use these kinds of labels, would be providing better and more aid to allow people to cope with climate change in their home countries.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is considered to be a real act that Canada can undertake. And I'm an advocate of increasing the international development funds, not increasing them, but meeting them, because Canada has been underrepresented in that area for a while, in order to really start addressing adaptation solutions in these countries, and whether there's opportunities there to spend some money now in order to really minimize the risks, both in countries, but also in our communities. And this is the real critical piece that ACT is working on, because we often think about adaptation as separate from emissions reduction. And so these two concepts or two responses to tackling the climate crisis have been kind of being done in isolation from each other. And at ACT, what we're saying is, let's find those adaptation solutions that are zero carbon, that don't actually exacerbate the problem further, like air conditioning in heat events, for instance. Are there better solutions, like planting trees for shade or whatever it may be? And so looking internationally and domestically at opportunities to really start building resilience, and quickly, is something that we advocate for.
Okay, Patrick, I've got a question here that's for you. It says, Patrick mentioned climate change emerged in the late 1980s. We know now that Exxon knew about it before then and had all the science ready about it. But the question is, what are Indigenous communities' experience of natural disasters and climate extremities in the past? Did people move from nation to nation? How did the people deal with that kind of displacement?
It's an interesting question, because prior to contact, there are two stories with one nation of displacement occurring, whether it was a natural disaster somewhere else. So I think the first time I read about it was Hugh Brody's book, Maps and Dreams, where he talked about displacement. And so we had this Indigenous population moving across Canada and winding up in northern BC. But that displacement was caused by colonization. So Indigenous people were fleeing the conflict that was occurring between Indigenous populations and the colonizers. But at the same time, the Indigenous populations also got a gun and took it out on their neighbors. So if they stayed, they were going to die. So I'd call that a refugee. Those people were subsumed by the Indigenous populations. My own nation there was something called the Athabascans that came in. Same scenario. I don't know why they're displaced, but they arrived en masse. But now we can't distinguish them from anybody, because they become part of the community as a whole. There's nothing in our collective conscious knowledge, somebody's called it cellular knowledge, that talks about climate change catastrophe, because we weren't dealing with climate change catastrophe. In a book, so I think scientists, big, really smart people, highfalutin smart people who aren't involved in immigration and refugee, talk about something called the Goldilocks principle, the ability of a planet to produce physiological foundations, air and water. What we have here now in what the world is facing. So for me, my memories go back approximately 8,000 years, and at no point in time were we hitting extremes. We weren't. But that's the event horizon. It's coming like this, and it's getting worse. So we know that extreme weather is going to occur in greater frequency, duration, and intensity. How do I prepare for it if I don't have the knowledge? And the answer is, you marry traditional knowledge about site-specific weather patterns and ecosystem cycles with science. Because now, if we know what's coming, Our definition of resilience at Kanaka Bar is the ability to shelter in place during an extreme weather event and repair the systems that give us quality of life, be that waste or Facebook. I mean, sorry, that's not quality. I don't know what that is. I'm just saying is Facebook's pretty darn important today. I want to say that while there is no necessary experience, when people have come to Indigenous people have opened their doors. That, of course, changed. So if you look at a book by George Manuel called The Fourth World, George Manuel and Michael Poslin wrote a book that was published in 1974, and it spoke about the Fourth World, and it introduces a concept that there's a period of mutual dependency that exists between an Indigenous population and their visitor. What colonization introduced, though, was the visitor ultimately overruled and oppressed the Indigenous population. Regardless what our new policy is, we cannot have a replication of colonization. I've heard that education is the great equalizer, but I'm also saying that climate change is the great leveler. If we can collectively get over issues of race and culture and age and sex, we're going to be okay. But what we have to do is set aside the differences and focus on the commonalities. That's why I talk about brothers and sisters. We're collectively facing a global existential crisis. Those who've done the least are going to suffer the most. So we can send aid to them until we can send no aid no more. Or we can create the policies that allow people. I don't want to leave my homeland. And if it was just me, I would stay here until I die. But the problem is I'm a husband, a father, and a grandfather. And if no pressure, no urgency, if I become a great grandfather, I would ask them to leave so that they could live. Maslow's hierarchy of needs is something a little bit antiquated a long time ago. The physiological needs are disappearing across the world. So how do you rise to the top if you have no foundations? There's time to invest in Canadian foundations, allowing us to bring in the families. But the word I heard multiple times, Warda, you said it, can't say if Dr. Shaw did, was politics. How do I get elected if I create a climate migration policy? If my constituents don't want it. So how do we convince leaders to lead? That's not an easy one. So leaders lean into the wind, right? Politicians, they duck and dive and bend with the wind. Can you imagine extreme wind? Holy cow. I'm not trying to pick on Ottawa or Victoria. Leaders lead. We have 3 or 4 years to prepare British Columbia and Canada for the growing frequency, duration, and intensity and the catastrophes that trigger, but also to lead in a policy that allows the families who know in their heart of hearts, if they stay, they're going to die. And it's easy to prove that scientifically. If there's no more water, they're going to die. So would we allow those families? The question I also heard was, where are the people coming from? Well, in order for the people from Africa to get here, how are they going to cross the ocean? The people who are coming are the people around Lake Philip and Mead. And Laura, you can tell us all where that is. They're running out of water. Where are they going to come? Canada? Hi, I look like 1% of the population and I have 1% of the wealth. Can I move into your country? So the point here is, when we talk about no one is immune from climate change, it isn't just those who have the least. It affects all classes. So how do we open the door? Because we know one of the concerns with current immigration and refugee policy is people are buying their way into our country. That's what I've heard. Don't know nothing about it. What I want to say, though, is that if we have the land and the resources and the capacity to handle the influx, we can. But we need politicians who will lead. Canada was known as a leader, but Canada has also demonstrated some instances of hypocritical statements. For example, we know that GHGs, anthropogenic climate change, is occurring because of the release of GHGs. So we made a decision on a Monday to declare a national climate change emergency, and then on a Tuesday to approve a pipeline tripling our fossil fuel export. That's called climate change hypocrisy. That kind of hurts us internationally. There are other things that we see that we're just simply not ready. And at the risk, we don't want to be overwhelmed. So how then do we work? We have a conversation like this, it'll be played later. If I had a house, would I sponsor a family? That would be a family decision. Would my community open up its doors? We have land, we have water, we have food, we have shelter. That's a community decision. And for thousands of years, we've always opened our doors. What the risk is, how do we manage the overwhelming amount of demand? That's why we must work on this together, because together we're going to be okay. And if our politicians don't lead, and if our ministers and or our bureaucrats hide in their silos, we're not going to get anywhere anytime soon. This is a humanitarian crisis on a global scale. Canada, let's be leaders and give people a lifeline, to use Warda's words, because this is what people need.
Okay, I'm going to come back to you in a second, Patrick. But we only have a few minutes left, but I just wanted to ask Warda or Allison if you wanted to say anything in response to Patrick.
No.
See, Patrick, you did it again. You silenced everyone. Okay, well, here's what I'm going to say. So the program now that I am hosting, yes, we look at climate change and the challenges that it presents us every week, but we're a program that's focused on solutions, and it's not saying this is a solution that's going to fix everything. It's just looking at potential solutions and discussing them. So what I'd like you to do in the last few minutes here is talk about where you find hope, where you see potential solutions, and leave us with that kind of thoughtful answer about where this all goes next. And I think we'll start with you, Warda.
Thank you, Laura. So I see hope in lots of different facets of this world. I see hope in lots of test cases that are being developed. Lots of interesting facts are coming to Canada, and lots of lawyers are working on these facts and trying to develop legal arguments. Despite what I said about litigation not making excellent policy, sometimes it's the only way through. One thing that, I think is helpful is to write to members of parliament, and in terms of, professionals really using their professional areas of expertise to press on and explore how that expertise can be used for policy changes alongside things like litigation changes, because again, I don't think that's necessarily the best policy development. But if someone has any particular expertise in this group, then to use that in conjunction with member of parliament advocacy, and to advocate and to convey to your member of parliament how important climate change is to you personally, and to put that on the radar for your elected officials. And I see that becoming more of a public policy item. Shows like yours, Laura, were not a thing 5 years ago, and they were not a thing 10 years ago, certainly. So I see lots of hope in that. I see lots of hope in coverage in things like the Globe and Mail and CBC and the Financial Times and the New York Times, and The Economist. So that gives me a tremendous amount of hope that these issues are really coming to the forefront.
Can I just ask you, Warda, just a follow up on that? You talked about court challenges, and it is a way that obviously that law has evolved in the past in this country. Are there any challenges that have been filed yet on this particular question?
They have not been filed yet, but we have been, I think, Laura, when you and I spoke maybe a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, I mentioned that we were very carefully looking at legal facts, and we routinely get approached and we look at the facts, and bad facts make bad law sometimes. And so we pass on cases a lot, but we are excited about a number of cases, and we're excited about developing cases. And so in the next little while, I think you'll see some developments, but we haven't yet filed any cases.
And I'm sure you'll be in touch.
Yeah.
Allison, over to you. Where does your mind go when I ask you about hope or solutions?
Well, to be honest, it's a bit of a follow-on from Warda's initial comment on the generational differences. So, of course, I'm working within a higher education institution and surrounded by a lot of really passionate, interested young people who are very, very interested in learning about solutions. And I see a higher education system that's starting to respond to that desire in terms of thinking more systemically about solutions and partnerships with different sectors and different communities in order to really translate the science, policy, technology, best practice into action. And certainly that provides hope. That's definitely the area that ACT, the organization that I'm working with, has been involved in for the past 15 years. And I see that mobilizing even in a more widespread manner. So the other piece of that is from the other side, working with local governments and different orders of government and different types of actors that are all interested in overcoming the kind of siloization of expertise that has occurred and that has really kept solutions in the climate change and sustainability realm very, very slow. So there's a huge emphasis in professional communities to really start building more systemic cross-disciplinary, cross-sectoral solutions, which I think is the only way to accelerate solutions building moving forward. So that's quite hopeful in my world.
I will just say, Allison, on the question of the students and the higher education. The week before last, we did a program about climate change education in universities with professors from UNB who are starting the first mandatory climate change course for first-year students, they think, in the country. And these two professors told us, and we shared, that they were willing to share their syllabus and all of their materials with any other teachers who were interested in it. And we have had a flood of continuing emails from other university professors who are so interested in being able to teach this. There's a hunger for it among the student body who feel that this is now, and they need to learn everything about it that they can, not just a science perspective, but from all disciplines. It seems to be a full court press. So, Allison, you are in the right area in the university, and I'm sure it's this tidal wave, so to speak, forgive me, of information and exchange happening across the country. All right, Patrick, over to you. I'm sure you have some hope and some solutions for us.
Well, Laura, this is the first time we've actually spoken in virtual. Normally I have a yellow tie on. The yellow tie is a symbol for the eternal flame of optimism. And people always ask me, how can they stay lit when everybody's, well, raining on you? It's because I believe. I believe in humanity, the collective good that exists in humanity. I sat there and looked at Warda, and she said she's not young, she's not old, she's just somewhere in the middle. And it brought a tear, because the work that she's doing is making a difference. When I look at Dr. Shaw and how they're using the academia and getting the results of academia, what happens is I have faith in humanity. We can continue down the path of capitalism and greed, or we can choose to do something different. And what we've learned as human beings is that what made us human beings is the power to choose. I put in a little side thing, I found a book in a used bookstore. Never heard of it before. This is that book, Climate Change and the Health of Nations. And the author explores displacement over the course of 20,000 years. But the author says, we're not capable of handling the impacts today. The population is such that it's going to overwhelm all our resources. So we have a plan now, and we have a process now. We can't save everybody. That's going to be a given. But we can save a lot of people. And that gives me hope. When I see Canadians, when I see British Columbians, when I see the international world standing up, at COP27, did we finally not get a commitment from the developed countries to send resources to the underdeveloped countries? But it took years to get there. But it's because through perseverance and through articulation of awareness, through resistance, articulation, awareness, options, we know what to do. We just need to do it. And we need leadership to deploy the resources internally and externally. And maybe we'll just sit on our hands and hedge our bets. And I talked about climate change hypocrisy. I certainly don't want to talk about climate change denial. I think we're beyond that. But I am bloody concerned about climate change apathy. As we heard, politics. If I do this, will I get elected? Well, do it. And if you lose your ass, so what? Or case or seat or whatever you want to call it, so what? The point is, you made a difference. And each and every one of us here in BC and Canada on the Zoom call can make a difference. The secret, though, is you have to get up because hope flows from action. And if it's the wrong one, learn from it. If it's the right one, we can all collectively live with it. Hope flows from action. And everywhere I've traveled, I've met young men and women who sometimes I want to weep because despite the eco-anxiety and solastalgia, another big word I can't pronounce and barely spell, they believe what they need is leadership. And I believe that's where I'm going to spend the rest of my life is, well, I spoke to one leader one time. He says, am I biting you? Or what is it? Am I hitting you with the stick or sweetening you with the sugar because it's your choice? I can't remember. I always mangle analogies, just so you guys know. But the point is, leaders lead. The challenge, though, is there's an amplified voice. And I want to leave people, and it's not a good one. Do we even want people in our country? I watched a young lady retire because she got 93% of the world's hate mail. This is a young leader who retired. It's exhausting, it's overwhelming. But if you have that common cause, optimism flows from a belief, a common cause. And common cause generates the action. We can look after each other. And this is where I'm seeing is everywhere I go now, whether it's Vancouver, I'll be in Ottawa in the next little bit. I'm hoping to meet for some people over there, but they're going to be scared because I'm going to be wearing my yellow tie. People kind of avoid the guy in the yellow tie because his optimism and belief is infectious. If I listen to former Chief Patrick, I'll probably lose my MP seat. But I could go to sleep at night and look at myself in the morning. And so I thank all of you. Laura, your show, I've never seen it yet.
Yep.
Couldn't try to find it.
Listen to it, my dear friend. It's not on the television.
Well, because I don't watch TV, but if I have links, I could probably listen to the past ones. So ladies and gentlemen in the audience, and for Laura and for the people of ISIS, BC and the Ismaili Center, you believe, and I know you believe because you put this event on. So thank you from the bottom of my heart, not only for myself, but from my family and for the future generations yet to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. As you can tell, Patrick leads with his heart, but he's got quite a brain too. Thanks all of you. I'll send it over to Jonathan now.
Thank you so much, everybody. I want to start off with some thank yous to Warda and to Allison and to Patrick for your wisdom and your time and your inspiration, and also a special thank you to Laura for leading this discussion and for your work in this area. I'd like to thank our partners from the Ismaili Center here in Vancouver for joining us in putting on this discussion. It's really inspiring, I think, listening to you all, and a wake-up call, including to those of us who work in today's immigration system, and we know the pressures that we already feel and that communities already feel. And, you know, when we consider our vision around helping communities thrive and people in communities thrive, we have to realize, in Patrick's words, that there is no immunity and that we really do risk overwhelming demand to a system that is already facing great demand, both from cataclysmic events and from long-term migration patterns from all of this. So, you know, my takeaway from today's discussion is to keep making this part of our dialogue and our discussions when we talk about the immigration sector and the immigration system. We have to keep talking and raising consciousness. We have to keep raising the connections between these issues so that we can encourage our leaders, our elected leaders, to lead, and we can encourage leaders from our community, whether that's our student community, our young people, because there's great risk, but there's also great opportunity. And we thank you so much. We'd like to thank everyone who joined us tonight. And if you have takeaways that you'd like to share, please post those responses in the chat box. You'll also see that we've posted a short evaluation form to fill out. Your feedback is hugely helpful in thinking about these events, which we continue to want to do in the future. The recording of this session is going to be posted on our website and through our social media. Please promote that if you can. We really would like as many people as possible. It's one of the great advantages of virtual meetings is that we can have people from so many different places, but we can also share so much. So if you want to be part of raising that consciousness, please share the recording of this event. What else do I need to say? I'm looking at my notes here. Yeah, mostly one last thank you to our panel, to the team at ISS at BC and the Ismaili Center who helped put this together. Please stay tuned for future events, and thank you for attending. It's 1 minute to 6 Pacific time, so we're going to finish exactly on time. Thank you, everybody. We really appreciate your time and your commitment tonight. As a speaker, as a listener, as someone who has helped contribute to putting this on, I want to give a heartfelt thanks to you all. Thank you, and have a great rest of your evening. Bye-bye.
Bye.